Welcome to another in this series of webinars for parliamentarians. On behalf of Mr. Derek Springer, the Director of PANCAP, and on behalf of Mr. Vivian Rokum, the Senior Project Officer of the 10th EDF program, I bid you welcome. This webinar has three parts: presentations from our two panelists, then a question and answer period. The audience can type in their questions, and we'll ask the presenters to answer them at the appropriate time. As you might be aware, stigma and discrimination are still rampant in the Caribbean. The latest UN-AIDS report pointed out that discriminatory attitudes ranges from as low as 18% to as high as 70% in some countries. One way to address this is to create a legal framework that prevents discrimination. PANCAP led the process to create a Model Anti-Discrimination Bill. The CARICOM Legal Department was very instrumental in giving technical legal advice in the drafting and finalization of that bill. We are pleased to have Ms. Sandra Bart, who has been practicing law in Guyana since 1992. She joined CARICOM Secretariat in 2005 as a legal officer, and she has many responsibilities, including drafting and vetting contracts, memoranda of understanding, agreements among member states, agreements between CARICOM institutions, establishing these institutions and bodies, and participating in review of model bills to be approved by CARICOM's Attorney Generals, and which can subsequently lead to the enactment of these bills. She also has been an adjunct professor at the University of Guyana, where she lectured and tutored in such areas such as public and international law, law of contract, and law of torts, among others. I would now like to invite Ms. Bart to give us an overview of CARICOM's Model Anti-Discrimination Bill.
My presentation, which is looking at the procedures and drafting process of the CARICOM Model Anti-Discrimination Bill. I would first of all like to discuss a few definitions. We talk about laws, legislation, acts, and these are written rules governing persons' behavior in society. And as we know, laws regulate almost every aspect of our lives and cover wide-ranging activities. Policy. When we talk about policy, we are talking about a problem or issue being addressed. And legislation is the result of this policy now being translated into legislative form. And bills now, when we talk about a bill, we are talking about the rules or laws in draft form. They have not yet been enacted into law. So these are just some terminology that I wanted to clear up before getting into my discussion. Introduction of legislation. When we talk about creation of laws and introducing legislation for a particular country, the initial role is that of the policymaker to decide whether to introduce new or amending legislation. And clear policy is therefore integral to effective legislation. And so the policymaker's role is an important prerequisite to effective legislation. I'm stressing this because I know this morning we are comprised largely of policymakers. This is our target group this morning. Policymakers, therefore, are required to identify problems or issues to be addressed, decide goals and objectives, consult interested persons and bodies who are referred to as stakeholders, both within and outside of government, and recommend which option will most effectively achieve the goals and objectives, and set out how the policy is to be implemented, monitored, and evaluated. I have attached a link there to the Impact Justice website, which gives a lot more details on the legislative process and drafting instructions for those who may wish to read further on that. Okay, so we have covered what we mean by policy. So we have already created a regional policy and a draft model anti-discrimination law. So this policy was created by PANCAP with funding from the World Bank, and this was done in 2010. And so this policy provides a compendium of policy interventions which are needed to address HIV stigma and discrimination at the country level. So recall in the previous slides, we talked about in-country policymakers need to determine and develop policy. So this has already been done at a regional level, okay? So the models that we are discussing here, the regional policy and the model bill, the model law, these are intended to serve as guidance to countries in the preparation of national policies and anti-discrimination law. And so countries are free to adopt the model policy and law either in full or in part, depending on each country's circumstances. Okay. And before I go a little further, just to stress the point about the fact that it may be adopted in full or in part, because one sticking point is that some countries do have certain legislation covering certain issues. We recognize that, but then we are asking that member states have a look at the policy and legislation, and they can take from that what is felt to be necessary, manageable, or doable at this point in time. Sorry, I forgot I was supposed to put my screen on slideshows. Are you seeing? Okay. I'm not hearing anything. I trust that everybody's hearing me clearly.
Yes, you go on. Their mics are mute.
Yeah. Just to mention briefly the methods used in coming up with this policy. More of this can be gotten from the report, the 2010 report, but just to mention briefly here, there were assessments done of the national legislative frameworks, and there were national consultations from which they got recommendations, and there was expert consensus on areas which were recommended at the national level. The regional policy got the approval of the 20th Caucus of CARICOM Ministers of Health in 2011. And the Ministers of Health approved that policy and accompanying model legislation as part of the process of finalizing this model policy and legislation. And they requested that the models be forwarded to the Chief Parliamentary Council and then to the CARICOM Legal Affairs Committee for review and finalization. The Chief Parliamentary Council are the draftspersons in member states. So each member state has their Attorney General's chambers and they have their draftspersons. And so there are usually meetings where all the Parliamentary Council sit to discuss and decide and review laws. And so the recommendation was that the draft be placed before the Chief Parliamentary Council of the region, all the member states represented, and then for it to go to the CARICOM Legal Affairs Committee for review and finalization. The Legal Affairs Committee, or LAC, or LAC as it's called, it's a treaty body established by the revised treaty and comprises ministers with responsibility for legal affairs, or attorneys general, and so those are the members of the Legal Affairs Committee. So these bodies are usually required to review and approve model legislation before it is recommended to member states. So the Parliamentary Council, Chief Parliamentary Council, approved the draft model anti-discrimination bill, in 2012. And it was recommended for consideration of the Legal Affairs. Just a brief discussion mention here. It was discussed at a previous webinar, but just to mention here that this draft model law, generally it moves beyond HIV and has as its object the elimination of all forms of discrimination on the grounds of HIV status, sexual orientation, lawful sexual activity, disability, gender, status as an orphan, and so on. So I just wanted to mention that here as we go on to discuss what came out of the various meetings. So having recommended the model bill to the Legal Affairs Committee, the officials, senior officials with responsibility for considered the model bill, and they noted certain concerns that member states had raised regarding the model legislation. And I just mentioned a few here, general information. So some of the member states mentioned that they had already had legislation in their jurisdictions which may cover some of the issues covered in the model bills. Okay, because I had mentioned that before. They also raised the point that the bill contained provisions that might not resonate well at the current time in member states. There are several contentious provisions. So these were raised at the senior officials meeting, and nonetheless, while the officials recognized these concerns, they encouraged member states wishing to do so to adopt the bill in whole or in part based on their national policies and priorities. Following that meeting of the senior officials, the bill was placed before the Legal Affairs Committee, and this is the meeting of the AGs themselves. And as was done prior in the SOLAC, the Legal Affairs, the ministers, and the AGs noted the concerns of member states, and nonetheless, they encouraged member states wishing to do so to adopt the bill in whole or in part based on their priorities. It was also recommended that members should consider the bill, consult internally, and submit comments to the Secretariat so that these comments would be circulated to other members so that, there would be a feeling across the region as to what is happening in each member state and the way things were progressing in member states. Some comments were received from member states, not many, I think a bit less than half of the 50 members. And these comments were circulated to member states. As we know and we have discussed, that some time has elapsed since the approval of this regional policy and the model law. And, well, what is the aim and the PANCAP or the next steps, as I should say, is renewed efforts on the part of all to ensure adoption by member states of the regional policy and model law, and hence we are here. This is part of the program of reminding member states of where we are, what has been agreed, and what has been approved. So this in a nutshell. Colleagues, thank you for listening, and questions, I understand, questions will be raised later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bart. I think you have given us quite an overview, and we now have a legal overview plus a historic one, so we can see where the bill came from and what it was intended to do. Our next speaker or panelist is the Honorable Laura Tucker Longsworth, who would be doing the second part of this webinar. She has been the Speaker of the National Assembly of Belize, and Madam Speaker has had quite a long and distinguished career in health, especially in the area of nursing, as a nursing practitioner, as an educator, as a standard bearer in nursing, and now as an entrepreneur. She has also chaired and has been active in other areas of health. She has been the chairwoman of the National AIDS Commission, president of the Belize Cancer Society, a commissioner on the Chronic Non-Communicable Disease Board, and director of the Healthy Caribbean Coalition. Because of her public service and more especially her work in health, Madam Speaker has been awarded or has been the recipient of numerous awards. In 2003, she was the recipient of an award for professionalism and service from the Loyola University, Chicago. And in 2013, she received an Outstanding Woman Award from the University of the West Indies, Open Campus in Belize. In 2015, she received the OBE, and in 2016, she became a PANCAP Champion for Change. She is leading the legislative process for change, and she is championing the adoption of the CARICOM Model Anti-Discrimination legislation in Belize. I'd now like to invite her to tell us more about some of her challenges and to elaborate perhaps a little bit more about the process in Belize. Madam Speaker.
Hoping that good morning, everybody. It is my absolute pleasure to be joining you this morning to share a little bit of our journey with the development of our own anti-discrimination legislation. We're very pleased that we have undertaken this initiative. We felt that we were ready to take it on following visits by PANCAP, the Justice for All program, but more importantly at the local level over the past 3 or 4 years with support from the Global Fund. We amassed a body of evidence to look at barriers to care and various other barriers, and most recently we completed a population size estimate that further gave us some other information about our key population. And so we decided that we would proceed along this line to make use of all the evidence-based material that exists, including the PANCAP model bill. And so we're very pleased to share with you that process. So during my presentation, I will just give you had an overview of the CARICOM model, and I will share our process, what we're doing, share with you what we submitted to Cabinet, because we had to submit a Cabinet note for them to give us the green light to proceed. I also want to share the areas that will be covered by the bill, some challenges and successes of the process, and of course, the way forward, which will be very challenging. In terms of, just a second, let me move this. In each of the Caribbean Regional Strategic Framework on HIV and AIDS, PANCAP emphasizes the creation of an enabling legal environment, and that is to include the reviews of existing laws and policies to determine how they impact on the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the region, and of course the promotion of new laws that can protect the dignity and rights of key population against stigma and discrimination. PANCAP's Justice for All program is consistent with the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Specific elements include achieving legislative reforms to modify and repeal discriminatory laws that infringe on human rights as a means towards an AIDS-free generation. In 2010, PANCAP hired legislative drafting consultants to prepare a draft bill for discussion. The bill was then revised, as you heard earlier this morning, and in consultation with the Parliamentary Council for CARICOM in 2012. And since then, the model bill has been available for national jurisdictions to incorporate into their own domestic laws. We are happy that we are taking it on. I'm hoping that we are walking with the entire Caribbean, and we're of course walking with PANCAP towards we really appreciate the support that we have received so far. The bill will seek to provide for the protection of persons against discrimination, including harassment, victimization, and vilification on the grounds of HIV status, sexual orientation, unlawful sexual activity, disability, gender, status, including those of persons who are orphans, and to provide for related matters. The bill also provides for the establishment of a commission and other bodies that will have the powers to investigate alleged discrimination. The Belize process is interesting. I must say that this process began earlier this year. We planned to begin last year. We made the plans to begin this year, and so far we have a timeline that we're following. We're a little bit behind for various reasons, but nevertheless, the work has been constant. The proposed bill has been in discussion since the start of, for Belize, since the start of the new millennium. It was recognized that we need certain kinds of legislation. And that led to the first review of the HIV-related legislation, which culminated in the National Policy on HIV/AIDS that was approved in 2005 by Cabinet. In 2008, a second legal review took place to identify gaps in the legislative framework affecting people living with HIV and AIDS. And of course, then that led to another consultation spearheaded by the National AIDS Commission in January 2014. In September of 2015, Belize joined the world in adopting the new Sustainable Development Goals and committed to work tirelessly for the full implementation with the pledge of leaving no one behind. Goal 10 of the Sustainable Development Goals in particular is of interest to all of us, and that is because we need to reduce inequality within and among countries. And if you look a little bit closer at Target 3, it requires that we take steps to ensure equal opportunities are available, and that we should reduce inequalities to eliminate discriminatory laws, policies, practices, and also take steps to promote appropriate legislation and policies in this regard. In 2017, the National AIDS Commission conducted a legal environment assessment that was completed, and it built on two previous reviews and consultations. The literature review was conducted on many things, many documents, legally binding international human rights treaties, international custom, non-binding ones, and relevant national law, policies, legal reviews, and other publications pertaining to HIV and AIDS in Belize. On November 12, 2018, delegation headed by the Chief Executive Officer in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, His Excellency Patrick Andrews, presented Belize's national report on the third cycle of the Universal Periodic Review to the Human Rights Court. Belize received 124 recommendations, of which 98 were accepted by us, since we thought that many of those were regarded as being in process of implementation. And I should perhaps share that a little bit about the Universal Periodic Review. That is a mechanism of the Human Rights Council established in 2006 by the UN General Assembly. And that process involves examinations, periodic examination of human rights performance through an assessment of the country's human rights records and how human rights violations are addressed and so on. And so when our CEO addressed the council, he really updated them on what we are doing in terms of human rights. And of course, that led to, further recommendations. And I should add that we also look at the whole issue of hate crime. We had a hate crime forum that also really opened the perspectives that we had to look at to make sure that we really created an inclusive and relevant legislative document. So the recommendations include the rights to education, health, sexual and reproductive health, gender equality, gender-based violence, non-discrimination, looking at disabilities, persons with disabilities, and the establishing of a national human rights institute. And I want to say that I'm particularly pleased to share with our listening audience this morning that we are moving ahead with most of these issues, and particularly that of the National Human Rights Institute. I contacted the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I was pleased that to hear that they're moving ahead with a feasibility study that should begin very shortly, I think by mid-year, which will include consultations with parliamentarians and key persons, and also examine where the Human Rights Institute should be established. And they are particularly interested in the Ombudsman's office, since there are some best practices in Africa and on other places regarding the use of the Ombudsman's office as a National Human Rights Institute. In March of 2019, the NAC and the Office of the Special Envoy hosted the Hate Crime Forum, and we got excellent support for this forum from the Human Dignity Trust through the Equality and Justice Alliance. I should say that we were honored to have our own Chief Justice, Kenneth Benjamin, join us at this forum, as well as the Human Rights Commission. And it was extremely impressive, because they gave support for us to move ahead with legislation, since our Constitution had all the parts in it. It instructed us not to tolerate discrimination, but nobody had created the challenge of a bill to make sure that we could uphold the mandate of our Constitution. So that we're pleased about that. In January 2019, we established what we call our Anti-Discrimination Bill Steering Committee, and they're with responsibility for guiding this process. We looked widely for representation, and so on that committee, we have our Ombudsman's Office, the Ministry of Human Development, with the able support from the Chief Executive Officer, Ms. Judith Pucci, the Chair of the National AIDS Commission, the Special Envoy for Women and Children and the spouse of the Prime Minister, Mrs. Kim Simplis-Barrow, the Human Rights Commission, the Attorney General's Ministry, who is playing a key role in this matter and has been extremely supportive, the Ministry of Health, our civil society representatives, including our key populations, who we are very happy to see are 100% on board with giving us support and understanding that we have to take a wide approach and utilize a strategy that will eliminate any opportunity for anybody to hold back that bill. And we also have the Belize Council of Churches, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and the Ministry of Labor. And I should add that those two representatives have said very clearly that they, as soon as we have the draft, they want to be sure that they share it with their membership, because already there are questions that are being asked about the bill and the implications for business. The Attorney General's Ministry of Belize, with support from the Solicitor General and the Senior Crown Counsel, is the lead agency with responsibility for overall guidance and supervision of this process. The Attorney General's representative serves as the chair of the committee. We thank him for that. He's a dynamic gentleman, Mr. Shepherd, and also is the chair of the National AIDS Commission's Policy and Legislation Subcommittee. He has been fully engaged in this process. PANCAP's CARICOM Model Anti-Discrimination Bill is the basis for our bill, which we will use for our own purposes, and perhaps insert things that has to do with hate crime, as is the request from our membership. In February of 2019, the steering committee drafted the cabinet note, and with our key champion, the Prime Minister's wife, we submitted that to the Cabinet Secretary, who obtained approval for us to proceed with drafting. And I should add that the National Commission also sits in the, well, I shouldn't say sit, but it is under the office of the Prime Minister. So it is clear that he is supporting us in this endeavor. The technical assistance was requested from various places, but we're very happy to share with our audience that PANCAP is right on board, and along with the Human Dignity Trust. It's a very expensive process. It will, we really must have, and the technical assistance includes communication consultant who will develop a communication strategy for the anti-discrimination bill. And we thought that this was very important because we looked at the Section 53 repeal, and all of us agree that we need to continue the process of communicating, and so people can understand what the process is all about. And also we need a legislative drafter who will be expected to draft the bill utilizing the CARICOM model. The consultant will advance the work that will be required for both areas to achieve its goals before and after the legislation comes into effect. And I think that's an important process. And I think what we're trying to do is to make sure we cover all bases, and we keep thinking about what else we can do to make the process really a dynamic one. The communication consultant will provide dedicated and focused communication capacities specific to that bill. So this is part of his TOR, his or her TOR. And we will also, coming out of that consultancy, we will have a relevant media plan to drive the communication campaign, especially on the act and the implications, and especially the significance of those who experience discrimination, because we have to share that information, because oftentimes people think that we have only an LGBTQ agenda or some other hidden agenda, when we are saying that it's inclusive for all of us because of our constitutional mandate. The legal draft person will be expected to work closely with the Attorney General's ministry and consult with stakeholders widely, civil society, public and private sectors. It is also expected that the draftsperson will work closely with the Attorney General's ministry, who, as we said before, is fully on board, and they welcome the consultancy because, as you can imagine, there is just the matter of limitations of human resources, and so they're very happy for the additional assistance that will result in a bill being produced along the timelines that we have in mind. Technical assistance has also been requested from the Human Dignity Trust out of the UK on behalf of the Equality and Justice Alliance, who will also support the legal drafter for the Attorney General's ministry. And the National AIDS Commission is now in the process of coordinating and finalizing all the plans for the mobilization of resources from those two agencies that I just mentioned. We had to create a cabinet note. It's a procedure for us. We have to get their permission because they're the ones who will have to take the bill to the House. So our cabinet note had to it goes to cabinet and they look at it to see what the justifications are for the creation of the bill. And so the purpose of the cabinet note was to seek their approval to proceed with the drafting of the bill and to ensure that we have their permission to move forward to examine other legislative pieces that will need to be amended, especially those that there are gaps in those laws that are not compatible with what we are attempting to do, and others that are other pieces of legislative frameworks that are outdated or which may still contain discriminatory practices and policies. So recommendations in the cabinet note included the comprehensive anti-discrimination bill that must include race, religion, origin, sex, sexual orientation, age, health status, and other grounds that may lead to discrimination, and the consequential amendments to any other law, as I mentioned before, that is not in compliance with Section 3 of the laws of the Constitution of Belize. And that's Section 16(1)(3) of the Constitution of Belize deals with the protection from discrimination on grounds of race. 16(1) deals with that no law shall make any provision that is discriminatory either of itself or in its effect, and no person shall be treated in a discriminatory manner by any person or authority. And also gives you a definition of discriminatory, which they include what they explain. They further explain to mean affording different treatment to different persons attributable wholly or mainly to their respective descriptions of race and so on. And so we are right on track with, to proceed with our anti-discrimination bill. Areas that the bill will address include but are not limited to the Social Security Act, listing occupations involving close contact with people with sources of HIV/AIDS. We're going to look at anything that can be discriminatory in that regard. Law enforcement, anything that employees can claim benefits for. People do have trouble with collecting their benefits and so on when they're linked to certain things and certain illnesses related to HIV and or sometimes their sexual orientation. The National Children and Families Act, allowing that the permitted age for accessing sexual health and reproductive services without parental consent to be the same as the age of consent for sexual activity. The Criminal Code to prohibit hate speech and hate crimes. Medical Services Institution Act for to look at criminal penalties on a medical practitioner for breaches of confidentiality and so on, determined by the Medical Council. And the Prison Act to provide adequate and appropriate medical treatment to inmates who are persons living with HIV/AIDS. We will also be looking at the Immigration Act to repeal a section Section 5(1)(e) that excludes homosexuals and sex workers among its list of prohibited immigrants. And we'll also be looking at labor and business through an amendment to prohibit employers from requesting HIV/AIDS tests, and really they do that to impose and to limit employment and so on. We'll also be looking at the prohibiting wrongful termination based on your HIV status in the Labor Act. There are other things that need to be looked at. The National Insurance Act to prohibit discrimination in life insurance and mortgages. We want to look at the Education Act to prohibit children from being denied access to school through discriminatory actions. And importantly, Landlord and Tenant Act to include a clear prohibition against discrimination. And this is something often we were asked recently, what does that mean? And that if for those who do not know, persons identified as either of a different sexual orientation, LGBTQ, persons with HIV/AIDS, TB are often given notice from their rentals and communities and even their families when they're identified in those categories. So then, what are our challenges? We have persistent and systemic stigma and discrimination that threaten to undermine the Belize's initiatives in terms of achieving the UN target of 90 by 2020, and then to end AIDS by 2030. The Caribbean governments, including Belize, have been slow to utilize and implement the Model Anti-Discrimination Bill, and lack of financial resources. We estimate that this process will cost us to a minimum $100,000 US. There are other challenges that I should mention, and those has to do with challenges from sections of the religious groups who have in the past been very effective in being vociferous in the media regarding their disapproval of, for instance, our health and family life education curriculum or gender policy, or Section 53 repeal and so on. And they've managed to slow down some of the passing of some of those policies and initiatives. And so we are taking steps to make regarding communication strategy to mitigate that happening. But it is a huge challenge for us nevertheless. And I should mention that Belize is entering a election season. And so the political climate, we have to gauge very carefully, and I think we have to be expeditious in creating this bill. by the end of this year. Our election, general election, takes place in November 2020, and politicians and parliamentarians will not be too happy to have anything interfering with their campaigns, their electoral campaigns. The successes, though, we do have political will, obviously, because of the cabinet paper. We're getting support from the Attorney General's ministry, the special envoy, and we have champions. Mrs. Barrow is a champion, and the fact that we sit in the Prime Minister's office, and also we are very happy about, with the members of our steering committee. It's very inclusive and comprehensive, and we always are open to adding anybody that the National Commission and other members think should be on the committee. The steering committee includes a civil society, key pops, faith-based organizations, and so on. And then we have the support of our local, regional, and global technical groups, financial support from PANCAP and Human Dignity Trust. And of course, we are pleased to utilize the PANCAP's Model Anti-Discrimination Bill. For us, the way forward then is for us to revise our timeline, since now we know that our technical consultants will be on board very shortly. We'll be finalizing our technical and financial assistance from PANCAP and Human Dignity Trust, develop our communication strategy, move swiftly to draft our bill so that our consultations can begin, countrywide public consultations, and of course all the revisions to obtain feedback so that we can revise and come up with a final bill. And then we need to present the bill to our National AIDS Commission, our partners, or stakeholders for endorsement. And finally, presentation of the bill to Parliament. We think that most people think it is ambitious, but we've got to move swiftly if we're to get this done. And we're grateful for all the support that we're receiving. In ending, I want to acknowledge PANCAP's director, Mr. Derek Springer, and Dr. Green, who sparked the interest for us to take on this initiative through the Justice for All program, and for all the meetings and just the advocacy that they have been doing all the time. That certainly has been the catalyst and the driving force behind this initiative. I want to thank our Chief Executive Officer in the Ministry of Human Development, Judith Alpuche, who accompanied the CEO in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to Geneva to speak on the matter of the Universal Periodic Review. And CEO Alpuche was in touch with me the entire time to respond to questions that were being asked. And I want to really thank both herself and CEO, His Excellency Patrick Andrews, for taking on the commitment, which allows us to move along. I want to also acknowledge our steering committee members, who are a wonderful group of people who attend meetings and contribute. We should also acknowledge the National Committee on Families and Children, and for their contributions. The Attorney General's Ministry, the National AIDS Commission. I want to really thank my own Executive Director, Enrique Romero, who is always willing to revise and work overtime to call a meeting or to reach out to somebody to move us to the next level. And also, finally, to Ms. Gracia Carecia from the Human Dignity Trust for her willingness and her her drive to work with PANCAP and ourselves to get the bill completed. Thank you very much, and I look forward to receiving your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I think you've outlined a very comprehensive and elaborate process for us. I want to thank both our panelists, and our audience have been sending us a few questions. We have a few more minutes remaining. So in the 9 minutes that we have remaining, I would like to pose those questions to both of you. First of all, one of the panelists, one of the audience members have said to us that they want to extend thanks to you, Madam Speaker, for such a outlining the process in Belize. They feel that a lot of progress has been made, and they were wondering if you can outline maybe a couple of lessons that you have, that through this process that you have embraced, that can be shared with other Caribbean countries who are still contemplating in going in this direction. So I'll put that one first, and then we have a few others.
Well, thank you very much for the question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So the lessons learned for, I think the biggest lesson I can share is to work with our partners, to be inclusive, but most importantly for us to move forward with such a bill that deals with not only a small group of first key populations, but to extend it so that it becomes more inclusive. It is for a wider, for the general population, so we embrace it generally, and then of course we go down and make sure that everything is in there to make sure that our LGBT community is well fortified in terms of what we have in the bill. And so they're working with us in that regard. So we have opened it up. This is a anti-discrimination bill, is for the people of Belize, and I think that is what is going to make it more palatable, people will be more receptive in, and so far it has worked. I don't know if that helps you. Thank you.
No, I think that helps, because sharing the experience, I think the other parliamentarians who are listening from other countries would want to contemplate that. I know one of the challenges that countries would have is the adaptation of the model legislation to a more country-specific legislation.
Yes.
And I know your process has been that you would be working with the help of a consultant to help you to customize the bill.
That's right.
Would Belize, because we keep getting this this question all the time, and I think Ms. Bart had mentioned it too, that should countries take the entire bill or take sections of the bill? And if you're taking sections of the bill, which sections would be more appropriate?
Okay, and so that is a process that the steering committee takes on, because they're all at the table. And so I think that I outline a few areas that they're particularly looking at, and they're adapting it to the Belize situation. Also utilizing that body of evidence-based work that I mentioned earlier. We had looked at where the barriers are, age of consent, all those things, utilizing the other documents that has to do with gender policies, looking at all those factors. So the adoption of the model has to be country specific, and we are taking a lot of time and using the local data to inform the bill. And so yes, like Ms. Bart said, the committee will decide based on the evidence before them, and that's what we do. That's what we continue to do, and it's working well so far, because they have identified some areas immediately that they will be taking on.
Okay. So when you would have completed the customization of the model legislation,
yes,
to fit the Belizean needs, how long do you envisage that consultation period to be? using this customized bill?
That is going to be decided by I guess our consultant is going to help us with that. But there's an experience that I have and that I have brought to the National AIDS Commission, and I can share it quickly. When we were supporting the Belize Cancer Society, was supporting the Ministry of Health in implementing the HPV vaccine. What we did, we divided up the task, and we went to faith leaders, their bishops. We went to meetings and so on. Any pockets of resistance, that's what we did. And I think that the communication plan for this initiative will require us, and we took over 6 months just to do that. So the consultations here will be more intense because we have to tackle it because we are in a short time. So, but we think that by the end of December, we should be ready to present that bill to Cabinet.
Okay, that's as you said earlier, that's quite an ambitious.
It's very ambitious, and we're not saying that we're going to achieve it, but if we don't push ahead, it won't happen really, because there are many people who are not interested in us moving ahead with this bill.
But one of the other challenges that some of the other Caribbean countries have pointed out to us is they too would like to have maybe technical financial resources
Yes.
in helping them with the adaptation of the model legislation to their country.
Yes.
How can they perhaps maybe work with, I know you mentioned like the Human Dignity
Yes.
Trust.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way that these other countries who might have an interest can have contact to establish maybe some relationship to get some technical assistance?
Well, what we have done, Dr. Anthony, is we just arranged a meeting with the executive director of PANCAP and also with Human Dignity Trust. We want to bring us together as a value added so that we can perhaps forge ahead with support for other countries as well with this collaboration. And so I'm looking forward to that meeting that takes place next week, Monday. And I'm sure that we are very happy to just speak to Human Dignity Trust on this matter. Mr. Romero, the executive director, has arranged the teleconference. And so I am sure that something positive will come out of that. And we can, I guess, PANCAP and ourselves can easily share the outcome of that meeting.
Okay. And on that very positive note, let me once again thank you for sharing this journey that Belize has been on. I think it's an inspiration to the other countries who are thinking about it, because in a very short time you have been able to accomplish quite a lot. Yes. And it's quite impressive to think that you have gotten so much accomplished within this short period of time. I know legislative changes can really take a long time to accomplish. So we want to congratulate you and your team and the members of the steering committee for the work that they've been doing, and we wish you well, and we look forward to celebrating with you when you take the legislation to Parliament sometime in December.
Well, thank you very much for the encouragement.
So on behalf of the PANCAP team, let me thank yourself and Ms. Bart for participating in this panel. And it is our hope that we can continue this webinar series for parliamentarians, and hopefully through this medium, we'll be able to reach out to more parliamentarians and encourage them to make the necessary legislative changes so that we can indeed end AIDS as a public health threat by 2030. So thank you very much again for your participation.
And thank you, Dr. Anthony, and your team for having me on your webinar.